World of Warcraft does not just have a tank balance problem, it has a tanking problem, and that difference matters. Because Blizzard recently stepped in with tank buffs aimed directly at Mythic Plus survivability, more passive mitigation, better cooldown uptime, more help for specs that were falling behind. On paper, that sounds like exactly what tank players needed. But the reaction from the community has been more complicated than that. Some players are relieved, some tanks are happy to finally feel seen. Some are looking at the buffs and saying, finally, maybe this role will stop feeling like it is constantly fighting for its life. But a lot of the conversation is not just about damage intake. It is about pressure. It is about responsibility. It is about being the player expected to know the route, set the pace, survive the pull, position the mobs, manage the mistakes, and then take the blame when the run goes badly. That is the real story. Blizzard is trying to fix tank survivability, but many players are asking a bigger question. Can Blizzard actually make tanking feel fun again? This is the first real MMORealm breakdown, and we are looking at what World of Warcraft players believe about tanking right now, why that belief exists, and what it says about the future of Mythic Plus. The current controversy started with a very clear signal. Tank shortages have become one of the biggest pain points in dungeons. Players are waiting for tanks. Groups are stuck, forming around a role fewer people seem willing to play. And even outside high-end content, the shortage is visible enough that the community keeps coming back to the same question. Why does nobody want to tank? Blizzard's answer, at least mechanically, was tank tuning. They said tanking had fallen behind their intentions for keeping up with incoming damage in Mythic Plus. So they buffed several tank specs. Blood Death Knight got smoother damage intake. Vengeance Demon Hunter got stronger baseline defenses. Protection Paladin got more durability and stronger defensive tools. Protection Warrior got help with magic damage, damage over time effects, and ignore pain. Those changes matter. They are not nothing. For some players, the buffs were a welcome sign that Blizzard understood tanks were getting hit too hard. When a tank feels like they can randomly fall over outside cooldowns, the role stops feeling stable. And when the role stops feeling stable, fewer people want to put themselves in charge of the group. So yes, the buffs helped, but they also revealed the deeper problem. Because if the main reason people are avoiding tanking was just numbers, then a tuning pass would feel like a solution. Instead, a lot of players reacted like this was only part of the problem. The bigger frustration is that tanking has become one of the highest pressure roles in the entire game. In Mythic Plus, the tank is not just another party member. The tank is the pace setter, the route planner, the pull manager. The player expected to understand what the group can handle before the group even proves it. If the damage dealer dies, people may blame the damage dealer. If the healer struggles, people may blame the healer. But if the run falls apart, the tank often becomes the easiest target. Too slow? Blame the tank. Too fast? Blame the tank. Wrong route? Blame the tank. Someone pulled extra? The tank still has to fix it. That is why so many players are saying the same thing in different ways. The issue is not just whether tanks can survive. The issue is whether tanking is worth the mental load. And this is where the tank debate becomes more interesting than a normal balanced discussion, because there are basically three camps in the community. The first camp wants tanks to feel powerful again. These are the players who remember when tanking felt like being a raid boss in a dungeon. You could pull big. You could survive chaos. You could carry messy groups. You were not invincible, but you felt durable enough to make plays. This is where the old Asmongold Protection Warrior clip becomes important as a symbol. Years ago, there was a viral moment where a tank could pull a ridiculous amount of content, survive through chaos, and make the role look almost absurdly powerful. Whether that exact clip caused any specific Blizzard change is not the point. The point is what players remember it representing. A version of tanking where the tank felt huge, self-sufficient, durable, almost like the fantasy of the role was turned all the way up. For some players, that was peak fun. They do not want tanking to become a one-player game, but they do want the role to feel powerful enough that taking responsibility feels rewarding instead of punishing. The second camp believes tanks should rely on the group. From that perspective, if a tank can pull half a dungeon while everyone else dies around them, That is not healthy MMO design. The healers should matter. The damage dealers should matter. Group coordination should matter. That side of the community sees overly powerful tanks as a design problem because it makes the rest of the party feel less important. And honestly, that argument is fair. An MMO dungeon should not become one tank dragging 4 spectators through content. But the third camp is where the real MMORealm story lives. This group is saying the debate is not really about whether tanks should be overpowered or dependent. It is about how much pressure the role carries. Because even if Blizzard perfectly balances tank survivability, the tank is still the default leader in pickup groups. The tank still needs to know routes. The tank still needs to understand dangerous trash. The tank still needs to decide pull sizes. The tank still gets punished socially when the group does not like the pace. That is why some players look at the May buffs and say, good, but this does not fix why people stopped tanking. It helps tanks live. It does not necessarily make people want to queue as tanks. And that is the disconnect. Blizzard's stated goal was to help tanks keep up with incoming Mythic Plus damage. That is a real problem. Nobody wants to tank if their character feels paper thin. But player perception is wider than that. Players are not only asking, can my tank survive this pull? They are asking, why does this role feel like homework? Why do I need to study routes just to avoid getting yelled at? Why does one mistake feel like a public performance review? Why does a casual key sometimes feel like I am auditioning for a tournament? That is the kind of pressure a small mitigation buff cannot fully solve. Real quick, if you like clear MMO breakdowns without digging through hundreds of comments yourself, hit the like button and subscribe to MMORealm. Because this is the kind of MMO story that gets lost when we only talk about patch notes. The patch note says, tanks got buffed. The player sentiment says tanks are tired, and both can be true. The future of tanking in World of Warcraft probably depends on whether Blizzard can solve both sides of the problem. The mechanical side is obvious. Tanks need to feel sturdy. They need cooldowns that make sense. They need damage intake that feels predictable. They need spec balance that does not make most tanks feel like they are choosing the wrong character before the key even starts. If Brewmaster Monk and Guardian Druid feel ahead, and other tanks feel like they are constantly catching up, that creates frustration. But the social side may be even more important. World of Warcraft can buff tank mitigation every few weeks, but if new tanks are still terrified of leading a dungeon, the shortage will keep coming back. If returning players feel like they need outside tools, route knowledge, community research, and thick skin just to play the role, many of them will simply choose damage instead. And that is the scary part for Mythic Plus. A tank shortage does not only hurt tanks, it hurts everyone. It slows group formation. It makes players more desperate. It makes people more impatient. It makes every tank feel even more valuable, but also more exposed. The community says, be nicer to tanks. And that is true, but the game itself also has to make tanking easier to enter. Not easier in the sense that the role has no skill. Tanking should have skill expression. Great tanks should still stand out. But the entry point cannot feel like a wall of roots, blame, and pressure. That is why the Asmon Gold-style tank fantasy still matters. Not because tanks should go back to being immortal, but because players remember when tanking felt powerful enough to be fun. The modern version of tanking often feels like the responsibility stayed high, while the forgiveness got lower. That is the heart of the controversy. Blizzard can tune the numbers, but can they rebuild the feeling? Can they make tanking feel strong without making the group irrelevant? Can they make tanks rely on teammates without making the role feel helpless? Can they make Mythic Plus challenging without making the tank feel like the unpaid manager of 4 strangers? That is what players are really asking. The May buffs were a start. They showed Blizzard recognized tanks were behind where they wanted them to be. But the bigger test comes next. If tank participation improves, if players feel less punished, if new tanks feel more comfortable stepping into Mythic Plus, then this tuning pass may be remembered as a turning point. But if the shortage stays the same, then the message from the community will be clear. The problem was never just tank survivability. The problem was the tanking experience. And that is much harder to fix. That's the story in MMORealm. Drop your thoughts below. Are tank players right to be frustrated, or is the reaction overblown? Should tanks feel more self-sufficient again, or is group reliance better for the game? And what MMO topic should we break down next?